Welcome to Fossils, Evolution, and Extinction, the view from geology, but I like the first one we had better, Dave. You must have changed that one. Earth's major extinctions. Dinosaurs are gone. Are humans next? So you'll shed some light on that. This is Dave's third class with us. Hard to believe, but we're through three. This class follows the real successful one that we just finished on beach science. If you're interested in that topic, go take a look at that. That was a great class. And then from further away from that, we had the incredible, amazing, unbelievable geologic history of Orange County in Southern California. So if that gets you interested at all, that's also available at the video center there. He received his PhD in geology from Northwestern University in 1979, so he's just a young guy. And had his Bachelor of Science from USC. He's taught at Stanford and University of Puerto Rico, as well as many times at the Oasis Senior Center. So that's, I think, originally how we heard about Dave and went after him to see how things could go. He's also worked as a geologist at Chevron and Exxon. And as he says, he's very passionate about his teaching, especially for seniors. So we're happy to hear that and see those sorts of statements. So his very broad knowledge of local and regional California geology. So it's taught me an awful lot about that over the short time that I've known him. And his particular interest in stratigraphy and sedimentology, 3D modeling, geologic impacts on development, Caribbean geology, petroleum exploration and research, and much, much, much more, I'm sure. So join me in welcoming back Dave LaRue.
Now, Gary swears that I had a different topic for this, and this is a very honest topic. I got roped into this because we were talking about other things I could talk about, and someone said, you should do a thing on extinction. And I said, well, that's not really my thing. And I said, well, I'll do it and I'll research it. So anyway, so I've kind of tweaked things a little bit. I'm going to shock you in this class. And so I had Gary put seat belts on these chairs. So you should, they're virtual seat belts. So but I'm going to try to knock you out of the chairs with 3 different things you probably haven't realized that are, a couple of them are pretty shocking. You ready? Okay, here we go. All right, so famous joke. So I'm going to do the 3 E's. I decided first E was educate you about some stuff that you didn't know about. And entertain you, I'll throw in some things. And the 3rd E, I'm not really sure what the 3rd E should, any suggestions on what the 3rd E should be? Energize you. I could energize you or excite you, I guess. Okay, so that's what we're gonna do. Okay, I'm going to start off. So Gary wanted me to talk about extinctions, but the problem is you need to know a little bit about geology before you get to the level of extinctions, right? You have to know what's there before you can extinguish them. And that's what we'll talk about is the great extinctions. So I'm going to build the first class here today is I'm going to talk to you about sort of the evolution of what we call historical geology, which is my field. And then on the next lecture, we'll talk about the 5 major extinctions, all right? So I'm going to start you off talking about fossils and society, and I'll bet this stuff is not on the top of your mind. It's kind of interesting stuff. All right. Then I'm going to also talk about some evolution as seen through the study of fossils. The science of evolution is in the realm of biology and paleontology. That's not my expertise, but we're going to summarize some things. And then finally, we'll talk about extinction, which is sort of the opposite of evolution. And oddly enough, the world of extinction has a lot of different sciences in it. So paleontologists, geologists, geochemists, statisticians, and others. So extinction is a much broader field looking at the death of organisms. And I've actually got to participate in some of these extinction studies. Okay, that's about me. These are some of the places I've worked in doing geological studies. I've done a lot of Caribbean geology. I did my PhD in Northern Michigan. Spent 15 years working in the Bakersfield area. I've been to all those different places. Okay, fossils, evolution. Here we go. Okay, so we're going to start off just considering the humble fossil. All right. So these are fossils, right? So the first question I want to pose to you is, what have fossils meant to humans? You guys all know, oh, fossils are really old, and so on and so forth. But what have they meant to the history of the human race? I'm going to first talk about fossils and the flood myth. So let's go here. Imagine it's 5,000 years ago. You live in Iran, and you're with your dad hiking in the Zagros Mountains. Now, these Zagros Mountains are immense. Elevation of 14,000 feet with ski resorts. So they're really big. You're hiking up in the mountains with your dad, grumbling all the way because of the hike. And you see this rock. This rock is actually from the Zagros Mountains. And you see that there's clam shells in it, plecipod shells in it. And you ask your dad, I'm on top of a mountain. Why are there clam shells? Because they're obviously clam shells. Nobody would doubt that. And you're on top of a mountain. So he says something, let's get on with the hike or whatever. And then you go back down and you start talking to the village elders about what you saw up in the mountains. What's the obvious conclusion? A flood. They covered a 14,000-foot mountain. All right. So it can be considered that this is the interpretation that led to one of the fundamental proofs of the Bible. So you read the Bible about the Noahic flood, and now you can actually go hike on a mountain and prove it existed because they said it did in the book, and then you go and see it in the mountain. So therefore, that's a proof, right? Essentially all cultures, all early cultures have a flood myth. And the question is it because all of these different cultures found fossils at high elevations? Okay, now the other cool thing about fossils is you can buy them on eBay. So I just snapped this from eBay. Those are shark's teeth, $4.99. Look at that, trilobite, 35 bucks. And you can go up to thousands of dollars on eBay buying your fossils. All right. And the flood myth has generated some just fantastic art like this. Poor guys. Okay, a flood myth is a narrative in which a great flood, usually sent by a deity or deities, destroys civilization, often in an act of divine retribution. Most flood myths also contain a culture hero who represents the human craving for life. And here's examples of some of the different flood myths that I found documented. The Sumerian one's very famous, Greek mythology, Genesis, and so on and so forth. So flood myths are very common in different cultures. So because there's a flood myth now that's gone back, the scientists kind of want to own it. We want to investigate, well, was there really a flood? Now, the whole concept of the Noahic flood doesn't really fit with how geology works. So there's like no way we could imagine that, all this water comes and fills up the entire earth and then disappears and so on and so forth. So we can't really get a strict interpretation of the Noahic flood in terms of the geological understanding. Is there evidence of ancient floods? Well, yeah, there's floods that are occurring now on the East Coast. So yes, there's always floods, but they're always localized flooding. So all the cases where they've tried to find the evidence of the Noahic flood in in the Near East, they see evidence of localized flooding, but not really that anything as dramatic as that. Then there's the other people who say, well, this is a sea level curve from 24,000 years ago up to the present. And look, sea level has risen on the globe 120 meters, which is about 400 feet. So doesn't that count as a Noahic flood? Well, yeah, but it took 14,000 years to do it. And you could say, well, maybe there's a period here where the sea level rose faster, but it doesn't really make much sense. And of course, for the last 5,000 years, sea level's been pretty flat. So that's interesting, but it doesn't really answer the question. Again, the geologists really want to come up with a flood story because, there's a flood myth, there's flood myths, and I say, well, there must be some evidence of some humongous floods in history. So these guys, William Ryan and Bryan and Pittman are both famous marine geologists, and they did a study on the early Black Sea, and they noted that the early Black Sea grew from the early Black Sea here to the bigger Black Sea. And you can see it's a gigantic volume there because of flooding through this Bosporus Valley. So what happened was basically the Bosporus Valley was a dam with respect to the Mediterranean, and then it was finally breached, and instantaneously you had this gigantic flood into the Black Sea, raising sea level at some dramatically quick rate. So let's see what I say. They proposed a catastrophic flow of Mediterranean seawater into the Black Sea freshwater lake occurred 7,200 years ago, before present. So they were saying, well, maybe that's the source of the Noahic studies, or the Noahic flood, also described in the Sumerian myths. The rising Mediterranean spilled over a rocky sill at the Bosporus, that would be here. The event flooded 155,000 kilometers of land and significantly expanded the Black Sea shoreline. According to the researchers, 40 kilometers cubed of water poured through each day, 200 times the flow at the Niagara Falls. The Bosporus Valley roared and surged at full spate for at least 300 days. That sounds very kind of biblical too. As proposed, the early Holocene Black Sea flood scenario described events that would have profoundly affected prehistoric settlement in Eastern Europe, and possibly was the basis of the oral history of the Noahic flood. All right. So that was a good flood story, but this is an even better flood story. This happened in the Pacific Northwest, and this is glacial Lake Missoula. Glaciers reached their maximum extent about 15,000 years ago and had almost completely melted by about 10,000 years ago. It was during this glacial advance that a finger from the glacial ice sheet dammed the Clark Fork River, creating the glacial Lake Missoula. That's where the finger was blocking, and this is the glacial Lake Missoula, around 15 to 17,000 years ago. This is one heck of a story, so get your safety belts on this one. Okay, so water began to build up behind the 2,500-foot ice dam, 2,500-foot tall ice dam, filled with water to the east with water, creating a glacial lake the size of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario combined. That's a big lake. That's lake, there's the two lakes there. The water continued to rise until it reached a maximum height and elevation of 4,200 feet. As the water rose, the pressure against the ice dam increased, eventually causing the dam to fail catastrophically. The failure occurred when the water reached a depth of 2,000 feet. And this is what happened. It all poured out in that green area. See where it says flood path up there? It flowed at 9.46 cubic miles per hour, 386 million cubic feet per second. This is a big flood. Now, this is the hole that it carved. So this gigantic valley here, which is hundreds of feet high, is where the water was rushing in. And these things here, if you took my class on sand dunes last week, you'll know that these are dune forms associated with this flooding, but here the flood was hundreds of feet deep, and these dunes are, tens of feet high. They're really large structures. So this is evidence. They could never, before they understood this, this glacial Lake Missoula, they were like, what are these weird hills that are all aligned so perfectly symmetrically, until someone figured out that they were actually dunes from the flow of the catastrophic failure of the lake. This rate is 60 times the flow of the Amazon River, the largest river in the world today. At this rate, the lake probably drained in a few days or a week. Water moved at speeds between 30 and 50 miles per hour, racing across eastern Washington. Let's see, so 430-mile journey to the Pacific Ocean, carving an immense channel system through eastern Washington. So this is an artist. On the left, you see an artist's reconstruction of what it looked like, and this is the same view today. So this is, I don't know how many hundreds of feet high that is, but it's enormous, and all of this was poured with this water flowing out from the lake. So the conclusion is there have been giant floods in the history of the Earth, but these floods have been defined based on modern studies of geology, and they may not be relevant to the historical culture events that we talked about. All right, that was a fun little anecdote, right? Right? And again, wonderful art associated with artists' interpretations of what the Great Flood must have been like. That poor cow suffering here, right? A dog swimming. They're kissing. Look at that. It looks like they're kissing, and there's a flood going on. What are these people doing? Or maybe they're hugging. I don't know. That guy's washing his hair. So all sorts of things. And then this is just a wonderful depiction as well. Isn't that wonderful? And of course, then there's humor involved. So this is the solution we've devised for dealing with flooding caused by climate change, a Noahic interpretation. This is a great one. Hey, sexy, looks like it's going to be just me and you to repopulate the earth with the unicorns. By the way, I'm Greg. What's your name, sweetheart? Arnold. And that's why there's no unicorns, obviously. And then here's God spilling a glass of water. Okay. So evolution of thought about fossils, fossils in society. First of all, I want to notice, I hike around my home in Newport Beach, and if you look in the dirt, there's shell fragments everywhere. And this is at an elevation of about 200 feet. So the question is, how did the fossils get there? And this is more about the flood myth. So ancient civilizations would, they'd hike around in the mountains all the time, and they would find fossils, and they would puzzle about what the heck they were. And they have examples of Paleolithic stone knives that are based on the structure of fossils. So they saw the fossil and then sort of crafted a knife or a tool around it. The ancient Egyptians, some of their gods that they worshiped had fossils associated with them. The god Set was associated with a hippopotamus. And when they found bones of the hippopotamus, they'd tie that in with them. This is the Sopdu, the morning star, and these would be sea urchin cells were associated with that, shown here. So these are early cultures trying to deal with the discovery of fossils and what they might mean. Now, this is a wild one. This is a griffin. Fossils appear to be directly contributed to the mythology of civilizations, including ancient Greeks. So a classical Greek historian Herodotus wrote of an area near Hyperborea where griffins protected. By the way, this is not my font. I did this. This was somehow this got switched because this is pretty in my version, not truncated like that. Anyway, Herodotus wrote about these griffins protecting golden treasure, and these are some of the fossils that are found nearby. So the idea is that these fossils were discovered in some valley or on a cliff face somewhere, and they interpreted these fossils as being some sort of modern day dragons. So you can imagine if you hiked up in the mountains and you found a fossil that looked like an animal, you would assume, well, that animal is probably alive today, that not knowing, about extinction and so on and so forth. So that might have contributed to mythology. So some of the origins of our mythic creatures might be due to fossils, according to this line of research. And heck, dragons, anyone. So some of the early areas where dragons were described are associated with areas where you see different types of dinosaurs. So the interpretation is maybe these interpretations of dinosaurs led to the idea that these were dragons. All right, so now we're up to Aristotle. Aristotle eventually realized that fossil seashells from rocks were similar to those found on the beach. So the question is they would find these fossils in rocks, and the rocks are hard, and the fossils are in there and lithified, and you had to ask the question is, well, what are these fossils? And they came up with all these strange ideas, like they were actually sort of random petrifying fluids that just kind of looked like fossils. They weren't really living things, they were something else. And so Aristotle apparently looked at things like this and said, nope, those were living things. Later, Persian polymath Avicenna modified into the theory of petrifying fluids. So he was arguing that the reason this is in a rock is because there's some sort of petrifying fluid that made the loose shells become a rock. This is an interesting one. Pliny the Elder wrote of tungstones. That's a tungstone, Glossoptera, on the top there. So they found this thing and they thought, what? So if you looked at that thing on the top, what would you say it is? Well, you're no fair. But the point is if you didn't know what a shark was, you know, you lived on land mostly and found this big thing, you say, oh, that's a tungstone. That's some, you know, dragon with a big coming out like that. So anyway, they're fossil shark teeth, but they thought to look like the tongues of people or snakes. They also talked about this thing, which is what we call an ammonite, and they saw that thing and they thought, what the heck is that? And they say, well, that's obviously the horns of the god Ammon. All right, so they're confusing, you know, fossils with something that has, you know, reference to deities or giant snakes with tongues coming out, things like that. This one's a good one. Toadstones. Thought in the 18th century to be a magical cure for poison originating in the head of toads. So these are toadstones, and they're actually fossil teeth from a Cretaceous, you know, a fish from about 60, 70 million years ago. So here's a person extracting toadstones from a toad. And here's the actual fish that has the toadstones in them. Another good story. So in this study, we've all heard the story of what's the word? Cyclops. And the idea was the island of which they said was inhabited by the Cyclops, you saw fossils like this. And so the idea was that they saw these fossils and they came up with this creature called the Cyclops based on the fossil. Okay, again, this isn't my interpretation. This is some other person's interpretation. But again, they're tying the existence of the fossils to the historical interpretations of what happened in sort of these mythic settings on different islands. So where they thought the big eye was actually where the trunk was of the animal. Let's see. Leonardo da Vinci concurred with Aristotle's view that fossils were the means of ancient life. Da Vinci noted discrepancies with the biblical flood narrative as an explanation for fossil origins. So back when I had access to great libraries, I used to read geology textbooks from the 1890s and 1900s. And a lot of these geology textbooks spent a lot of time saying, well, where was the Noahic flood? You know, can you go to the Grand Canyon and see, well, this is where the Noah's Ark, you know, was floating, and this is after, and so on and so forth. And they also talked about when God created the earth in so many days, he created an ocean. Well, these are the sediments associated with that actual ocean. So the whole geology textbook was trying to find everything that was in the Bible. So basically they said, okay, the Bible's the fact. Now that it's the geologist's duty to go find out everything that's in the Bible, right? That was how they did the geology back in around the 1890s and the early 1900s. But there was problems. So what Da Vinci was saying was, you know, if there was a big Noahic flood, you know, and there's water sweeping across the continents, you wouldn't expect to see a beautiful thing with only clamshells in it. You would expect to see clamshells with tree trunks in it and lobsters and dead fish and all sorts of things all mixed together. But what Da Vinci noticed is all the fossils seem to be clumped together into only one type. So he was sort of challenging this Noahic interpretation of this great flood event. And then one of my heroes, and a lot of geologists' heroes, is Nicholas Steno. And one of the things Steno did was he looked at these tungstones, the Glossoptera, and he pointed out that they were indeed shark's teeth. So Steno was an interesting guy. He came up with all these laws of geology that are foundational in how we do geology today. And I'm going to talk about him. But the other interesting thing about him is he was a devout religious person. And at the end of his life, he became an ascetic monk and just lived in like a cave somewhere and only ate, leaves or something. So apparently, and one of the theories that I have is that like the geology in the Bible were at such odds in terms of how he interpreted things, it may have caused him to go off the deep end and just say, I'm rejecting geology and going purely into my religion. So some of Steno's laws are the following. They seem very simple and obvious, but if you see a layer of rock and another layer of rock and another layer of rock, he's saying the layer on the rock on the top is the youngest. That's obvious sense, but no one had stated that as a law. All right. Law of original horizontality. Layers of rock are deposited horizontally, and then with mountain building, they'll get bent and tilted and so forth. Layer of cross-cutting law of cross-cutting relationship. So here you have some sort of igneous body like a volcanic feeder system cutting across the layers. So obviously C has to be younger than B and A because it cuts them. So if you cut something, that means the thing had to be there before you cut it. And then he has things like the law of lateral continuity. If you imagine these were the layers of rock originally deposited, and then they were later eroded, you could say, well, that layer is just that layer, and that layer is that layer. There's some sort of continuity that can be restored. So anyway, Steno was one of the founders of the way we look at modern geology. And you can go to places like the Grand Canyon, and you can interpret the age relationship. So here, this basalt here cross-cuts these units, so obviously it's younger cross-cutting. The Zoroaster granite intrudes into this K unit, so obviously it's older. It's younger. The tilted rocks and so on and so forth. So we can actually go through this entire history using Steno's laws. In fact, if this was a freshman geology class, that would be your homework assignment. And so you can apply all of Steno's laws to this type of geologic problem. So he was one of the great he's sort of the Isaac Newton of the geology world. But again, then went sort of off the deep end and rejected everything and went into a religious study. William Smith was another famous guy in England back in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and he was the first one to really make maps of rock layers. So he would trace individual, sandstones and limestones and so forth. And this was the map he made of England, showing the different rocks that occurred. That's a good one, right? So Cuvier was a paleontologist, and he's looking at he's studying fossils, and he comes up with this really interesting observation. All the fossils are dead, which obviously because they're fossils, but not only are they dead, they're extinct, right? So he's seeing a fossilized dinosaur. There's no dinosaurs anymore. He's seeing a fossilized, shark or something. There's none of those sharks exist anymore. So he comes up with this theory called the catastrophism theory, saying that there's some sort of event that killed all these animals, all right, because they don't exist anymore. And that sort of like hints towards our next lecture on extinction. All of these facts, consistent among themselves and not opposed by any report, seem to me to prove the existence of a world previous to ours destroyed by some kind of catastrophe. Isn't that a wonderful, I mean, that's like a science fiction beginning or something. Okay, Linnaeus is a hero. He's not a geologist, but what he did was he was the one who constructed the classification system for the classification system still used today. So the important thing is with this system, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, we can now quantify both evolution and extinction over time. So for example, animals, chordates, mammals, primates, hominids, Homo sapiens. So that's how we, Homo sapiens, would exist in the animal kingdom. Or more exactly, we can talk about the humble dog, being part of the dog, or whatever type of dog this is, Canis lupus, is part of the Canis family, or the genus of the Canidae family. I don't know, I'm not a biologist, so apologize. A carnivore, a mammal, an animal with the backbone or a chordate, and then part of the animal kingdom. So you can start, so you can imagine at the very top, I've added Waldo because they didn't have any humans there. So the animal kingdom is all the animals there are in the world. And then the chordates would be all the animals with backbones. And Waldo has a backbone, we'd assume. And the mammals, Waldo is a mammal. And then he's not a carnivore. Is he? No, I guess we're omnivores. So I guess I wouldn't be. So then we go down to the carnivores and so on and so forth. So what we can do is now we have this system. This is a way now we can quantify evolution and extinction, and we'll be using this, the results of this in this class. And then, of course, Darwin comes along. He eloquently described a process of descent with modification or evolution, whereby organisms either adapt to natural and changing environmental pressures or they perish. When Darwin wrote on the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races and the struggle for life, the oldest animal fossils were those of the Cambrian period, now about 540 million years ago. So the crux of Darwin's theory of evolution focused on the elimination of inferior species as gradually over time through a process called natural selection. And of course, continue. 150 million years, 5 million years, walks erect, 3 million years, 25% of the time is spent on income and rent. How Darwin really came upon his theory of evolution. You know, I've all heard about Newton and the apple monkey fall out of a tree. This one I love. You're adorable. No, you're adorable. Charles Darwin was forced to abandon his survival of the cutest theory because they got eaten by an alligator. And the evolution of humor. Very well done. Is this movie on Charles Darwin any good? I give it 2 opposable thumbs up. Pretty good. Okay. Eat, survive, produce. Eat, survive, reproduce. And then what it's all about. All right. After Darwin. Since Darwin's time, the fossil record has been extended to about 2.3 to 3.5 billion years. This is when you're going to need your virtual seatbelts. Things are going to get hairy here, all right? The fossil record and faunal succession form the basis of the science of biostratigraphy, or determining the age of rocks based on embedded fossils. So I'm going to tell you about the science of biostratigraphy. Since the early years of the 20th century, absolute dating methods, radiometric dating, and so forth, have been used to verify the relative ages. So if you give me a fossil, and it's some unique fossil, I can tell you the general time period in terms of an evolutionary history that it might be. So for example, if you gave me this fish fossil, I could say, well, it's after those fossils and it's before those, but there's no date associated with them, right? It wasn't until we had radiometric dating, and you all know about carbon-14. There's uranium, lead, argon, rubidium, strontium. There's just whole bunches of different ways to measure the ages of rocks. And that's how we actually come up with these numbers. Okay, so this shows the evolution of the Earth from 4.6 billion years ago up to the present, where we have cars and people, pointing at flying pterodactyls and things like that. So this is a beautiful cartoon image of the history of the Earth. And here's a gigantic extinction we'll talk about next time, and another big extinction at the end of the Cretaceous. And it shows some of the different, here's when the trilobites come in during the Cambrian. So this is the great explosion of life at the base of the Cambrian. Here, this is what we call the Precambrian. We divide it into the Proterozoic and the Archean. So Cambrian, Ordovician, and then all of these different names here, Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, were based on different fossils. So they'd find new groups of fossils and they say, oh, these don't look like Cambrian fossils anymore. We're going to call this one the Ordovician, or so on and so forth. So all of these names here were originally associated with different groupings of fossils. And again, these numbers here are relatively more recent as we perfected radiometric dating. This is a fun theory. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. I just like to say that sometimes to go. Well, don't you know ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny? Any doctors here? All right. A wonderful debunked theory, the theory of recapitulation, also called biogenetic law of embryological parallelism. How about those for big words? Often expressed using Ernst Haeckel's phrase, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, is a historical hypothesis that the development of the embryo in a woman, in any animal, from fertilization to gestation or hatching, goes through the stages resembling or representing adult stages in the evolution of the animal's remote ancestors. So basically, when a woman has a baby and a baby is growing inside of her, it kind of goes from like, it goes up the evolutionary chain from like, oh, you're at the level of a trilobite, now you're at the level of a salamander, now you're at the level of a mouse, you know. So here's the example. Here you have a turtle, a chicken, a pig, a cow, a rabbit, and a person. And you can see that when they're embryos, they all look about the same. Yet with time, as they grow, they sort of differentiate until by the time the baby actually is born, they come out the individual animals. So this is the theory of ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, and it's just a wonderful theory, but apparently it's sort of it's not really used, or I'm just telling you because it's an interesting theory. Since embryos also evolve in different ways, the shortcomings of the theory had been recognized by the early 20th century and had been relegated to biological mythology by the mid 20th century. I have friends that I have a coffee group that I go to, and one of my friends is a former professor in the medical school at UCLA, and he argues, no, this is a good theory. So, okay, introducing the science of stratigraphy and biostratigraphy. So here's the thing. I'm a geologist, and what we do is we go to a place like the Grand Canyon or whatever, and we hike up the cliff and we describe the rocks. So we have a vertical line saying, okay, that's, 500 feet. And, at 100 feet, you go from a shale to a sandstone and so on and so forth. And what the paleontologists say, we have a buddy who's a paleontologist, and he says, oh, down here you see these fossils, and here you see these fossils, and here you see. So he comes up with a little evolutionary chart showing with each layer of rock, you see different fossils and how the fossils are changing. All right. And so this might be my diagram as a stratigrapher, and I say, oh, these are the different layers that I saw. And my paleontologist friend said, well, these are the different fossils and how they changed vertically. All right. Now, the thing is if you had 10,000 paleontologists working all over the world and talking to each other, all of that information would become integrated, right? So instead of having just one study of the Grand Canyon, we have like every rock on the planet, it seems, has been looked at, and the paleontology has been studied, at least in a cursory fashion. So we can now start saying about the entire history of the Earth, how fossils were changed over time, right? And that's the science of stratigraphy and biostratigraphy. So you can imagine that in different cliff faces, you might see changes in, what is this? Looks like man. Some reptiles, whatever that is, some sort of fish thing, yeah, horses, so forth. So all these paleontologists, and each one will specialize like in just one animal typically, they'll come up with these evolutionary pathways based on all these outcrops from all over the world. And that's how the science of biostratigraphy sort of evolved. So now, based on all these studies, we can come up with these different time periods based on what fossils occur. And we'd have, okay, we see shelled invertebrates showing up first in the Cambrian. We start seeing fish in the Ordovician. We start seeing fossil amphibians in what we're going to call the Devonian. We start seeing reptiles in the Carboniferous, and we start seeing mammals in the Triassic, and so on and so forth. And we're building up this evolutionary history about the age of the Earth. Then, okay, let's see, what was that? And then once we start having the radiometric dating guys come in, they can start putting numbers associated with these. So we can say that the end of the Cretaceous was at 66 million years ago, and so on and so forth for the different dates, which are very blurry on this. 444 for the end of the Ordovician, and so forth. So by integrating the fossil studies with the radiometric ages, we get this, we can make this geologic chart of ages.
Dave?
Yep.
Can you say a word about the scale on that and how it's so out of whack? If you don't put the, you know, the length of the Cambrian and Precambrian in there and then all of the rest of them?
Oh, we're going to get to that.
Okay, good.
Okay, thanks. So the idea is you have the fossils showing up at different intervals, and then the radiometric date guys come in. They might not be able to date this layer, but they can date this layer because it has some mineral in it that they can date, and one they can date here. So you have to sort of interpolate the age of that fossil relative to the actual dates. So the radiometric dating guys can't exactly date the same layer as where the fossils are, so they have to do a little bit of math to get it integrated. And you come up, this is a modern geologic time scale, and this is how we break down from 4.8 billion years ago, different periods of time, Eoarchean to 3.6 billion years, Paleoarchean, Mesoarchean, and so on and so forth, Paleoproterozoic, blah, blah, blah. And you know, and as we come up through time, you can see we've divided it. This time period here is about 5 million years. Yeah, 5 million years here. This is about 2 million years for that one there. So we have this entire history now of the Earth where we can talk about the late Oligocene or the Chattian interval, which would be rocks between 23 million and 27 million years ago. So this is the final output of the biostratigraphic and radiometric dating studies. And they have committees all over the world, and they spend, you know, weeks and months arguing about an individual date. Is it, you know, is it 469 or 470? And they, you know, yell at each other and all sorts of stuff. Yeah, especially the famous ones. So the end of the dinosaurs is at right here at 66 million. So because that, as we'll talk about, is a very dramatic event, they argue about, you know, like into the weeds about what the actual date is for there. And we'll talk about that a little bit next time. So again, what we do is we combine all the stratigraphic columns and we show the evolution of the fossils. So here's the fossil dates, and then we put this together and we come up with this cartoon that we mentioned previously. And that's how we come up with the sort of a geologic history of the planet. All right, so geologic time, the thing we can conclude is the Earth is really, let me get this right, really, 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 really old, right? 4.6 billion years ago. This is to Gary's point. Notice this is not a linear scale here. Time is kind of scrunched. So the first 2 feet at the top get you to about 23 million years ago. And then the next 2 feet get you to 145. So that's 5 times. And then 145 to, so it's not a linear scale that they're showing here. And it's really mean because they've messed up the Archean. So this is at about 600 million years ago. So from 600 to 4.6 billion, they said they put this much area, and then the rest is, oh, and here's where all the fossils are. So I did my PhD on rocks that are this old, and it's kind of hurtful because, you know, we love our rocks, and they're kind of like dissing them, I think is the right So they're dissing them. So this is unfair to the Precambrian, which is all these rocks here, and we don't like that. So they've taken, so 600 million, so that was that's 4 billion years that they scrunched up at the bottom. We don't like that. A lot of things happening down there. All right, so this is addressing Gary's point that it's nonlinear scale here. So let's go through this diagram a little bit. This, I like to say these were the smartest living things on the planet 3.2 billion years ago. So these are fossils from about 3.2 billion years ago. They're basically, you know about, you remember in biology, you talked about cells that have nuclei. Well, these cells were so basic, they didn't have nuclei. They're what they're called prokaryotes. Eukaryotes have a nucleus, prokaryotes don't. So these are basically what they call cryptalgal or cyanobacterial mats. This is basically like the scum on your bathtub after a while, you know, that green or orange scum that you get. That was the smartest thing on the planet for about 4 billion years. That's why I always say, you know, if you go to another planet, chances are, you know, if you see anything, it's going to be algae or, you know, it's not going to be some, you know, alien life form. So here's a blow up. And these are interpreted to be remnants of cyanobacterial mats. Now, interestingly, again, these things dominated the Earth for about 4 billion years, and then something wiped them out. So you could imagine a science fiction thriller where you have this very happy life form living for 4 billion years, and then something happened. You know what happened? This is one theory, but there's multiple theories. But you know what happened? Snails evolved. And they're like, ah, snails. And the snails are like, oh, this is great stuff. And so one theory of the destruction of these alga mats was by snails, which evolved, you know, around here. In some places on the planet, in the current planet, like this is a place called Sharks Bay in Australia, northwestern Australia. These type of algal structures still exist, and you can actually go visit. And for a Precambrian geologist, going to Hamlin Pool in Western Australia is like going to Mecca if you're into that religion. So that's what life was like for the first 4 billion years on the planet. All right, now this is going to be an interesting one. There's a thing called a carbonaceous chondrite. So these are meteors that come and they land on the planet, on our planet. They've been dated to be about 4.5 billion years. This is, put on your safety belts. This is going to get exciting. So these rocks are 4.5 billion years old. They're from space and they land on our planet, and we study them. The weird thing is they're 4.5 billion years old, and they've got carbon in them. They're carbonaceous chondrites. So Spanish-Italian team led by this blah, 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 has discovered that one type of meteor known as carbonation chondrite are capable of synthesizing organic compounds, which are key to prebiotic chemistry. So these carbonaceous chondrites have organic material in them. So the carbon is not like, there's different types of carbon. There's shell carbon, and then there's people carbon. These meteorites, which are billions and billions of years old, have organic structures in them before there is life on the planet, which is kind of odd. Shocking. Fun science, carbonaceous chondrite meteorites. The carbonaceous chondrite meteorites are fragments of asteroids that have remained relatively unprocessed since the formation of the solar system 4.6 billion years ago. These carbon-rich objects contain a variety of extraterrestrial organic, that means of life form, molecules that constitute a record of chemical evolution prior to the origin of life. Compound classes include aliphatic carbons, all these different things. Structural and stable isotopic characteristics suggest that a number of environments may have been contributed to the organic inventory, including so on and so forth. All right, so that's from, I don't know when this was published, 2002, Royal Society of Chemistry. All known life is based on organic compounds in water, and both of these have been present in carbonaceous chondrites. In addition, a plausible model has been proposed in which the feedstock for the development of life on our planet was supplied by the arrival of meteoric and cometary organic matter on the surface of the Earth. Isn't that interesting? Does this explain how we started our life cycle? So again, you have these rocks, these meteor fragments that are 4.5 billion years ago, and the carbon in them seems to be organic carbon, which means in our world, there's inorganic and organic. Organic means that it's from a life form. Okay, and that's puzzling. So you think, well, maybe there's seeds from a different dimension circulating. And you can buy these on eBay. So here you go. Carbonaceous chondrite, $8.99. There's a better one, $7.99, $7.50 for that one. But there's another way to interpret the problem. So the problem is the question is if there was no life on the planet when the Earth first formed 4.6 billion years ago, how did life evolve? Well, there's this guy, there's the famous Miller-Urey experiment, and I'll briefly summarize it. What they did was they basically built a little laboratory, and well, let's see what it says. It was a chemical experiment that simulated the conditions thought at the time to be present on the early Earth and tested the chemical origin of life under these conditions. The experiment, blah, 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 blah. So what they're trying to do is synthesize organic compounds from non-organic compounds. All right, let me see if I can go on. So the experiment used water, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen. So the idea is that early Earth had volcanoes, and volcanoes emit methane. Methane consists of CH4. There is also probably CO2 in the atmosphere. So the idea is that using water, because there was probably some early ocean, methane, ammonia, because there are a lot of ammonia gases, and hydrogen, you mix them together. And then what they did is to simulate lightning, they had like flashes of electricity, and they studied this in a controlled environment, then again, without any organic material present. And then after they did this experiment using those chemicals and the lightning to try to stimulate the reactions, then they looked and they'd actually formed a bunch of organic compounds. So one hypothesis says that the origin of life is associated with seeds, cosmic seeds from different planets or different universes or solar systems or whatever. And the second hypothesis says, no, you can form organic compounds inorganically. So this is the Miller-Urey experiment. But interesting, right? Okay, earliest life. All right, earliest evidence for life are graphites. Do you know what graphite is? Pencil lead. Ever been stabbed yourself with a pencil and you go, oh my God, lead poisoning? Oh, yeah. It's not lead, right? Graphite of biogenic origin found a 3.7 billion year old metasedimentary rock. So this is basically a piece of coal that's been heated dramatically, and they think it's the oldest potential evidence of life on the planet. So 3.7 billion, that's what, about 1 billion years after the Earth apparently formed. The earliest identifiable fossils are called those stromatolites, what we talked about briefly, which are microbial mats formed in shallow water by cyanobacteria or blue-green algae, scum, slime, whatever. The earliest stromatolites are found in about 3.5 billion year old rocks in Western Australia. And they're found throughout the Archean and become common late in the Archean cyanobacteria. They're also thought to be important in creating oxygen on the planet, because as you know, photosynthesis, you take carbon dioxide and then you create oxygen. So it's thought that these cyanobacterial mats, which are photosynthetic, gave rise to the formation of oxygen on the planet. So basically 3 billion years ago, if you were here on the planet, you couldn't breathe because there wasn't very much free oxygen. And it wasn't until about 2 billion years ago that we developed free oxygen. Life in the Archean was limited to simple single cell organisms lacking nuclei I talked about previously, called prokaryote. In addition to the domain bacteria, microfossils of the domain Archaea have been identified. There's no known eukaryotic fossils with the nucleus from the earliest Archean. So this is what a prokaryote fossil. This is actually a fossil of these organisms without nuclei. So these are the oldest life forms on the planet. So about now there's some argument about when eukaryotes, the cells with organisms, evolved. This one says 2.7 billion. The first simplest life forms were the prokaryotes, and then they didn't have a nuclei. And then the eukaryotes showed up, and this article says around 2.7 billion years ago. These eukaryotes can reproduce sexually. Prokaryotes reproduce only by cell division and are essentially clones. So here's a eukaryote fossil that's billions of years old versus the prokaryote. Now I'm hoping, do you guys get the magazine Onion? It's a parody magazine. It's kind of like, it's humor magazine. Anyway, I found this. Eukaryote traumatized after accidentally witnessing parent cell undergo mitosis. That's good humor. So these are what some of these stromatolites look like. So on the left, this is in Shark Bay, Australia, that I talked about previously. And these rocks are about 2 billion years old, and they're sort of sliced off stromatolites. So on the left is stromatolites in Shark Bay, Australia. These are in the Northwest Territories of Canada, about 2 billion years old. They look very similar. All right, here's the big shocker. These are these stromatolites in some lake, Thetis, wherever that is. Anyone know where that is? All right. You see the little circles with a hole in them? One of the rovers on Mars came up with this, all right? It's almost certainly the same thing as this. So this is a paper from 2020, so last year. Mars, algal, lichens, fossils, minerals, microbial mats, and stromatolites in the Gale crater. They think, based on the little Jeep driving around on Mars, they think they found evidence for life on the planet. Pretty dramatic. Now, this doesn't say that the life form is alive today. These look all like fossils, and there was water around back when these things were supposedly alive. So, but the amazing thing is that means that on Mars, there was life very similar to the life forms on our planet, probably at around the same time. So they're thinking these rocks are probably billions of years old too. So to me, that was pretty shocking. Finally, we found evidence of life on another planet. It's not alive, but still. And as I predicted before, it's not little men or anything. It's basically algal sludge. But nonetheless, it counts as life. Oh no. Button. Oh, there we go. Thank goodness. The mouse isn't behaving, so everything is chaotic here. There we go. All right. So here are some of these algal structures up close from this paper that I showed you. And these are the ones that are alive today. Right. So pretty good evidence. as a geologist, I'd say I'm basically convinced. You'd be pretty hard pressed to prove that these things aren't evidence of life on Mars. Uh-oh, Lucy's got control. Thank you. All right, so going back to our cartoon thing here, the Cambrian explosion of life, where you get all these hard-shelled animals, occurs at the base of the Cambrian. The reason it's thought that this Cambrian thing is so visible is all of these animals have shells and bones. If you didn't have a shell or a bone and you died, there's not much left behind, right? Except there's a few examples of rocks in this period before what's called the Cambrian explosion, where they can actually see life forms. And some of these are shown here. So this is, I think, in the Burgess Shale in Canada. They found things that are clearly life forms and some sort of evolved life forms, not just simple, eukaryotes or prokaryotes. Like this looks like some sort of ray or something like that. Okay, the Ediacaran period spans 94 million years from the end of the Cryogenian period to the beginning of the Cambrian period. It marks the end of the Proterozoic eon and the beginning of the Phanerozoic eon. It's named after the Ediacara Hills of South Australia. So it looks like we've got more complex life forms at that point. And then here we go into this would be in the pre-Cambrian, the latest pre-Cambrian, some sort of complex worm or something. And then at this point in the Cambrian, we start seeing trilobites, which have a hard shell. They're wonderfully preserved. And again, you can buy them on eBay. Let's see what I say. The Cambrian explosion was an event approximately 541 million years ago. The Cambrian period, when most major animal phyla appeared in the fossil record. It lasted for about 13 to 25 million years and resulted in divergence of most modern metazoan phyla. Definition of metazoan, any group of that comprises all animals having the body composed of cells differentiated into tissues and organs. So this is where we see different body parts evolve. And a digestive cavity with specialized cells. Okay, and then just to summarize, as we go up the geologic timescale here, we're going to see more complex life forms. Okay, here's some summary of highlights. First, invertebrates in the Ediacaran period. First fish showing up in, it looks like the lower Ordovician. First land plants about the same time. So before this time period, if you walked on the land, it's pure rock, no plants at all. All right. First amphibians, first reptiles, first dinosaurs, and then end of the dinosaurs. Weird animals that have come and gone, trilobites. So these are all examples of trilobites. You can buy them on eBay. I get a cut from it. No, I'm kidding. People have always wondered what trilobites were like. They seem to be like maybe crabs on the beach, that sort of thing, scurrying around. And again, on eBay, $9.50. These Moroccan trilobites are pretty impressive. They could be like this big, and this one's only 15 bucks. So if you're ever on a trip to Morocco, buy a couple of trilobites. Or you could just stick them in your carry-on. Graptolites. They don't really know what they're like. In shale, mudstone rocks, you see these little line things like that, and they're very clearly organic things, but we don't really know what the graptolite itself looks like. So people have suggested, well, maybe they look like these, and these are sort of their feelers coming down, and they break off, and that's what we see. But anyway, there's a whole evolutionary scaling of different types of graptolites. And when I took paleontology 50 years ago, we had to memorize Cloanagraptus, Loganagraptus, Didiomagraptus, and all the things like that. There you can buy your graptolites. Ammonites, remember the horns of Ammon? They're thought to be some sort of squid form that lived in them, like this. But again, very common. There you go. Evolution in the fossil record. Okay, evolution. Evolution is the change in heritable characteristics of biological populations. These characteristics are the expression of genes passed from parent to offspring. Different characteristics tend to exist within a population as a result of mutation, genetic recombination. Evolution occurs when evolutionary processes such as natural selection act on this variation, resulting in certain characteristics becoming more common or rare within a population. If this process of evolution gives rise to biodiversity at every level, so this general process gives rise to biodiversity. So let's look at the evolution of trilobites because they're so cool. So here we are in the Cambrian period, here about 524. And you can see this is how the different types of trilobites evolved over time. So here's our little cartoon diagram here. So here's the Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Carboniferous. So here's the Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Carboniferous. And you can see here's when trilobites died out at the end of the Permian. So that's the evolution of trilobites. The other way to look at that diagram is to say, wow, a whole bunch of trilobites died here, a whole bunch of trilobites died here, and a whole bunch, and then the last trilobites died there. So you can look at this as either an evolutionary diagram or as an extinction diagram. So right now we're looking at it in terms of evolution, but next lecture we'll talk about it in terms of extinction and what might have killed them. So here you can see, again, paleontology is an amazing subject because they go into amazing detail about every type of fossil that they encounter. And you see diagrams like this, and they'll sit there studying, trying to figure out, is this fossil here the same as that one or the same as that one? And in doing so, they can figure out the ages of the rocks and the depositional environment, because each one of these trilobites is characteristic of different types of water conditions. Maybe this one likes shallower water, this one likes deeper water, or something like that. So these fossils tell you more than just ages of the rock, but they're insights to what the depositional environment was like. Again, look at all that diversity. I love this theory. I can't find it written, and I've looked all over the internet for this, but one of the theories I was told when I was in college was the reason that trilobites, one of the theories of why the trilobites died out is they started off as very simple, and then they got very elaborate and fancy. And my professor, who was a paleontologist, said it was basically, they got overconfident and they were dressing too nice and they weren't really. So it became sort of a social judgment call, and that's why the trilobites died out. But I can't find the evidence that that was really a serious theory. And here's the thing about the graptolites, same sort of thing, different shapes and evolution over time. Evolution of horses, evolution of man, all these different fossil groups have these different evolutionary histories that have been documented. So here's the age of the fish. So evolution of different types of fish over time. And again, these types of fish really got hammered there. Up to the Cenozoic, let's see, at the end of the Cretaceous, not much happened. So not too much drama on that one. Summaries. So here's back to what Gary was talking about earlier, about this is the history of the planet. And so back to 4.6 billion years. And here's some of the things that have evolved. So from here all the way back to here, the smartest thing on the planet was basically, single-celled organisms, right? And it wasn't until this period right here we started getting the first hard-shelled animals. And then the human, this is really an overkill here because this should actually be just like a single line here where humans actually show up. But this is 500 million years, and the humans are just like a hair at the very end of that. Here's the dinosaurs coming in about here. First hard-shelled animals. first cells with nuclei. See, remember I said the first cell, the eukaryotes came in at 2.7. They're saying it's at about 1.7. So there's some argument there. Here's Chert is the earliest fossils on this at around 3.5 and so on and so forth. So this is sort of the history of the Earth. The interesting thing from a fossil interpretation standpoint, everything prior to here is pretty boring and there's not much action because it's all single-celled animals. Nothing was preserved because, or very little was preserved because they all only had soft parts. And you might see the little algal mats, but that was about it. If you haven't read Stephen Jay Gould and you want to learn more about evolution, he's a fantastic writer. He was a professor at Harvard, apparently really an odd character as well, but he writes beautifully. He used to write for this magazine, I can't remember which, Natural History magazine, I think. And he'd write these like 2-page articles. And then he'd take all the 2-page articles and put them into books. And here's a number of his books. And you can see they're very popular, 4.5 stars and so on and so forth. And so he takes the whole Darwinian theory and brings it up to when the books were written about 30 years ago. They're wonderfully written. Anybody can read them. And it's just, you know, if you want to learn something and not be, and also they're only 2 pages. The chapters are really short, so you can get through them pretty easily without being overwhelmed. Part 2. All right. So that's the end of the class. I'm a little early, but any questions? So the things that we should have caused you to use your virtual seat belts, hopefully, was the fact that we talked about fossils as being the origin of the Noahic flood and different floods in society. We talked about these carbonaceous meteors as possible helpers of life forms, as opposed to the Urey Miller experiments where they created organic things from non-organic things. They took methane and carbon dioxide and somehow combined them with lightning to form amino acids and different structures like that. And then the third thing was the discovery of what seems to be fossilized life on Mars. So those are the 3 things that I had to have you have the seat belts on so you wouldn't fall off your chairs. Any questions?
Well, oh, here's one. I was just going to say,
oh yeah, and you have to use the microphone.
I'm on my way. You wowed everybody that nobody had questions, but we do have ones. There's about 55 total here and at home who are watching. So
thank you.
It's more of a wondering than anything else, and I was thinking about climate change and all of that, and with the polar regions melting and temperatures are rising, and then all of the weather patterns and the climate changing in general. Has there or is there currently a study on what impact that would have on, say, Mars? Because you were just talking about Mars. As our planet starts to change, what kind, in proximity to the sun, what kinds of changes then would happen to, well, I mean, because.
Got it, I have it.
Yeah.
Okay, let me answer you. First of all, I don't know much about the history of Mars at all. I know a little pieces, but that's not the answer. But in terms of global climate change today, the best answer for what's going to happen in the future of our planet, because we're burning all these hydrocarbons, is looking at the past history of the Earth. So if you guys, you're an educated group, but if you don't know, the reason we're having this global climate change today, which is undoubted and real, is because we're taking buried organic matter in the form of oil, gas, and coal, and we're taking billions and billions of tons of it, which have been out of equilibrium with the rest of the Earth for millions and millions and millions of years, and we're burning it. It was all stored underground. All that oil, billions of barrels of oil were stored underground, and now we're pulling it out and we're burning it, and all that burned material goes up in the atmosphere. Some of it goes in the ocean and acidifies the ocean. And it's really what we've done by using oil, gas, and coal is we've altered the evolution of the carbon cycle on the planet. And we've taken what was hidden from view and we put it up into the atmosphere, and it's changed everything. Okay. Now, the thing is we know kind of what's going to happen, because this has happened historically in the history of the Earth. There's been all sorts of weird things that have, in the 600 million years that post, the Cambrian explosion, there's been tons of geologic studies about the evolution of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and so on and so forth. And there's been periods when glaciers were expansive on the planet, of our planet, and where they've shrunk. So in the Cretaceous, when the dinosaurs were around, they think that the North Pole, the climate there was kind of like Seattle today. So in the very North Pole of the planet, that was kind of like Seattle today. And they found on the North Pole, they found baby dinosaurs. And the question is if dinosaurs are cold-blooded, how can they have lived on the North Pole or near the North Pole? And people said, well, maybe they migrated, but they're babies, so they wouldn't migrate. So there's a lot of arguments about that. So the thing is what climate scientists are doing really is they're using the past history of the Earth to predict what's going to happen in the future. Now, just to let you know, this sounds like an anti-global climate change statement, but so far, what's happened on the planet up to today wouldn't even make a mark in any geologic record. It's so tiny. Okay, so far we haven't screwed things up, but we haven't yet. I mean, from a geologic standpoint, there's not going to be a layer, like, the famous thing where, remember the pop tops? We had always knew that there'd be a layer of rock where you'd have pop tops, and then there'd be no pop tops in the rocks above it. Well, right now we haven't changed the climate of the Earth such that you can take one rock and look at the rock above it and say, oh, things were terrible, but we're getting in that direction. What we can do is look at the history of the Earth and start making predictions about what's going to happen with climate change. And it's stuff's horrifying, but they don't really know the rates as well as they should, and so on and so forth. So yes, we know about what's going to happen. It looks horrendous, and it's based on the history of the Earth more than comparing to Mars. Microphone. Gary.
Well, I was just going to, I'll
Okay.
get to you. Just said that's kind of an entree. Next semester, we have a 5-session course on the impacts of climate change, where we're bringing in a lot of specialists in different areas here who will talk about it and what some of the major impacts are. So look forward to that. That's in April and May next semester. You'll see that in the catalog, which I think is coming out pretty soon. Is that right, Sharon? Yeah, okay. Middle of December.
Let me say one thing before you ask your question. By the way, the Earth's natural history has been one of extreme climates. 20,000 years ago, which is like a nanosecond in geologic time because it's 4.6 billion years. 20,000 years ago, there was an ice sheet a mile thick in Chicago. Okay, so if we were back in Chicago 20,000 years ago, there would be a mile thick ice sheet. Okay, so, and that's all melted. Okay, so major dramatic things have happened on the planet in geologic history. Yeah. Okay, what's your question? What's that? Not in 1,000 years. True. Yeah, we are accelerating the rates. There's no doubt.
It's not necessarily a question. It's just it's not necessarily a question. It's just a thought, because you get my little brain things moving. But I was just thinking about continental drift, and they talk about the Bering Straits and the woolly mammoth and all of that, and then the separation of the continents and whatnot, and how one species of animal migrated from one place to another. Yeah, and then survival of those animals in relation to the climate that they lived in, and then the adaptations and all of that. So when you're talking about all of this subject matter, and then we start talking about climate change, and this seems to be happening so quickly now, because there's so much wastefulness as far as mining and for coal and oil, and then its impact on earthquakes and causing, you know, shifts and the different types of earthquakes. And I don't know. I'm just going to take the opportunity to thank you because it's making me think about what I can do as an individual. We're so small in comparison to the earth. And sometimes I say, okay, I'm going to help in this direction. I'm going to help in that direction. But what good is my little good going to do if we're not all on board and not on the same page?
So the way I think about it is,
so it's more a thought than anything else.
No, it's good. 100 years ago, so it's 2020 now. In 1920, there was still horses on the roads. Remember? So we transformed from a horse society to a car society about 100 years ago, 110, right? So now we've got to transform from an oil-based society to an electric and nuclear and wind, you know, and so on and so forth, powered society. The problem is the transition from horses to cars was driven by capitalism. The transition from cars to electric vehicles and the stopping of pumping oil and stuff is going to be by government regulation, right? As far as I can tell. And you know how popular that is. I mean, we can't even get people vaccinated in the country for their own good. So that to me is very alarming. And you know, and also then the government regulation is also be looking at capitalism and saying, well, if I regulate this and it destroys our capitalism, you know, that's horrible. So this transition away from, you know, a hydrocarbon-based society is going to be fraught with difficulty, as we're seeing over and over again in the culture. And so what can we do is, all you can do is support a government that will change it, as far as I can see. I was thinking to myself, like, what would it take for me personally to become carbon neutral? You know, I could put solar panels all over my roof and, you know, get an electric car and, you know, but that would be one person out of, you know, billions.
Just takes a few more billion to contribute. Then
Yeah.
your little one thing that you're doing is, you know, expanded quite a ways, and, you know, supporting these things, and you save money, you know, so. And Dave is speaking as a former Exxon Chevron. So he knows.
I've made my share of mess.
Well, I think we've talked them out here, Dave. So
No other questions. Certainly you have a question. Your favorite fossil, anything like that?
you hit mine, the trilobites, boy. There's
I love trilobites.
every geologist loves trilobites.
Gotta love them.
Yeah. No, I don't think so. And it looks as though Marge isn't saying there's another one online there. So I think we can let you go home early today and beat some of the traffic. So.
Okay, and next time it's on extinctions, and we'll talk about the 5 major extinctions. I'm not really going to talk about the 6th one, which is the one we're causing
I think
now.
she adequately described the 6th one. That's
yeah, we're getting there.
We can touch on it.
We can definitely discuss it. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you all.